another new government program ever. And we're just going to pay off what we owe now. You would have to raise the top income tax rate and the top corporate tax rate to 88% at the federal level, not counting state and local taxes. You'd have to raise the current 25% rate to 66%. And you'd have to raise the bottom rate right now, which is 10% on the lowest income Americans. That would have to go to 25%. And that would let you pay off the debt, assuming we never created another government program ever. You know, I don't think we're going to do that. You can't tax your way out of this problem. Not going to get it. So if we're not going to tax our way out, can't get enough money in, we're going to have to deal with that money going out problem. So we're going to have to cut spending. And here, the other side of the political debate will tell you, yeah, they're for cutting government spending. And then you say, okay, so what spending are you willing to cut? And crickets. Because every government program gives money to somebody. And those people don't want their money taken away, and they vote. So we're certainly not going to cut anything that's popular, right? So if you really press these folks, we're going to, we'll find something that's unpopular, and we'll cut that. So what can we find that nobody likes? Foreign aid. Nobody likes foreign aid, right? Yeah, that's one that's really unpopular out there. So we'll get rid of foreign aid, and that's 1% of federal spending, folks. Not going to get there. 1%. Yeah. Have to something else. How about this? How about this? Let's kill Big Bird. Mitt Romney was prepared with this. We're going to sell the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and get rid of Big Bird and Cookie Monster and whatever. But that's probably won't do it just by itself. We're going to need something else there. So we have to, what's a big cause in Washington right now? It's, we'll defund Planned Parenthood. That's really popular right now among Republicans. And look, Big Bird and Planned Parenthood combined are 1/10,000% of federal spending. Now, I'm not talking about anything about the merits of any of these programs. The fact is, you're not balancing the budget and reducing the debt by getting rid of a handful of unpopular programs. And you're not getting there by eliminating fraud, waste, and abuse. The very first president who said he was going to end all fraud, waste, and abuse in Washington was Jimmy Carter. And every single president since then has specifically said they were going to target fraud, waste, and abuse. And we still have fraud, waste, and abuse. And I guarantee you, after President Trump leaves office, we will have fraud, waste, and abuse. We're not balancing the budget through any of those mechanisms. Because that's not where the money is. Do I know where the money is? This is where we spend our money. All non-defense discretionary spending. That's everything from the FBI to the FDA to the Department of Commerce to the Department of Education. Everything of that entails 16% of all federal spending. You could abolish it all. And believe me, there's many a night I've dreamed of this. You could abolish it all. And in 3 years, we'd be running a deficit again. You're not getting there by cutting a little bit of discretionary spending. Defense, 15% of federal spending. And the big argument in Washington right now is how much they should increase defense spending. I'm sort of on the other side of that, but the fact is, you're not balancing the budget by cutting defense. In fact, discretionary and defense combined are less than 1/3 of federal spending. I'm sure there's plenty of things we can trim there, but that's not enough to balance the budget. Where is the money in Washington? Social Security, 23% of federal spending. Medicare, 15% of federal spending. Medicaid, 10% of federal spending. Those three entitlement programs are half of everything the federal government spends. There is no way to balance the budget, to pay off the debt, unless you're willing to touch Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now let me clarify a term I just used, because somebody always objects to this. I talk about entitlement spending. And someone will always argue with me and say, Social Security is not an entitlement program, I pay taxes into it. All an entitlement means is an accounting term that means mandatory spending. In Washington, it means a program that is not subject to annual appropriation. It means that Congress does not vote every year on how much to spend. There's never a vote in Congress on how much to spend on Social Security. There's simply a formula that's built in. If you're retired, this is the amount you get. However many people are retired, they get the money. And Congress has to spend whatever it takes to make good on that promise. It's simply a matter of mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. In fact, people sort of confuse entitlement with welfare. Welfare is not an entitlement. Actual TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, the welfare program everybody talks about, is discretionary spending. Congress votes every year on how much to spend on it. So welfare is not an entitlement, and entitlement does not mean welfare. It simply means mandatory spending. But you cannot, if you're not willing to deal with all this, you're not balancing the budget. You're not getting there. So let's talk a little bit about these programs. And let's start with Social Security because it's the biggest. It's not only the biggest federal government program, it is the largest government program in the world. In fact, there's only something like 10 countries that have a budget larger than the U.S. Social Security system. It's enormous. And it's broke. This year, Social Security ran a shortfall of about $65 billion. That is, it spent about $65 billion more on benefits than it took in taxes. And that never gets better. In fact, it just grows and grows and grows. And in 10 years, we're talking about roughly $400 billion in shortfall. And remember, overall, that number was $32 trillion. Now, of course, in Washington, they don't worry about this because they've got a great theory. They can just go to the Social Security Trust Fund and use that money, the trust fund, to pay benefits until 2030. So anybody here who's retiring after 2030, I'm sure that makes you feel really good. But there's one, even with that, there is a small problem with that theory. And that is, there's no money in that trust fund. Remember that intergovernmental debt I was talking about? Those bonds, that's what's in the trust fund. Now, I know you can get a big food fight going in Washington if you start talking about the trust fund. Some people will talk about the trust fund's been looted. They stole the money from the trust fund. And another side will tell you the trust fund is as good as gold. All the trust fund is an accounting measure of how much the rest of the federal government owes the Social Security system. And it works like this. And I'm talking about the Social Security Trust Fund, the Medicare Trust Fund, the Highway Trust Fund, the Gulf Oil Spill Trust Fund, and all the rest. All the government trust funds work the same way. But from 1990 until about 5 years ago, Social Security ran a surplus. That is, it brought in more money in taxes than it was spending in benefits. Now that extra money has to go somewhere. They can't put it in a cigar box and bury it behind the Treasury Department. So what are they going to do with it? They buy this special issue Treasury bond with it. And once they buy the Treasury bond, the money that's used to buy it becomes general revenue of the federal government, and it's spent. It's spent on whatever the federal government spends money on, whether that's building roads and bridges or invading Middle Eastern nations. The money's gone. And Social Security holds the bond. And someday that means they will then go to the general revenue, turn in that bond, and expect general revenue to give them the money back to pay the benefits. And right now there's $2.9 trillion in bonds, as I mentioned. They are actually in a vault in West Virginia, right next to the Confederate war bonds. But it wouldn't matter whether they were there or not. Think about it this way. This year we ran a $65 billion debt in Social Security. What would happen if we had never run a Social Security surplus in the past? Never bought those bonds. There was no vault in West Virginia. In order to pay that $65 billion, what would the government have to do? If they're going to keep paying Social Security benefits, they got to come up with $65 billion. That means they're going to have to raise taxes by $65 billion, or cut other spending by $65 billion, transfer that money over, or most likely they're going to borrow $65 billion. Okay. We do have bonds in that vault in West Virginia. We ran a $65 billion shortfall. So what did we do? We took $65 billion in bonds out. We went back to general revenues and we said, federal government, give us $65 billion. Federal government says, we don't have $65 billion. Where are we going to get it? Well, we could raise taxes by $65 billion, we could cut spending in other programs and transfer that money over and use that to redeem the bonds, or what we actually did is we borrowed $65 billion and we used that to redeem the bonds. It's exactly the same set of choices as if the trust fund never existed. All the trust fund is a measure of how much money we're going to have to pay back to the Social Security system someday in order to make good on the benefits. That's all it is. It's an accounting gimmick. And even with that, after you pay back the $2.9 trillion, people always say to me, we should make them pay back the $2.9 trillion. Sure. And where's the government get $2.9 trillion to pay it back? They raise taxes, they cut the spending, and they borrow the money. The federal government doesn't have a $2.9 million money tree. So, it doesn't matter. We're short. And if in 2030, that $2.9 trillion is all gone, there's no more bonds in the trust fund, and we still have a shortfall that we have to keep making good on. Overall, $32 trillion that we're going to have to pay back to Social Security someday. If we're going to pay the benefits that are promised. So let me be perfectly frank to all you young folks out there. You're screwed. We lied to you. We are not paying you all the benefits we have promised you. You know, with the taxes we've got coming in, we cannot do that. But even if we could, I have to tell you, even if we could, did I not have a slide? Oh, even if we could, Social Security would be a lousy deal for you. I may have got that slide. Now, Social Security is basically a pyramid scheme. I mean, when you pay your Social Security taxes, none of what you pay in Social Security taxes is saved for your retirement. When you pay in, the money you pay in Social Security taxes immediately goes out the door to pay for people who are already retired. And then you hope that the next generation behind you will pay Social Security taxes that'll support you in your retirement, and they hope the next generation behind them will pay Social Security taxes that supports them, and so on. It works just like any other pyramid scheme. And just like any other pyramid scheme, it works great as long as you have a lot of people paying in down the bottom of that pyramid and only a few people at the top taking out. But look, we're aging as a society. No, life expectancy is increasing. We're living a lot longer. That means we're collecting a lot more Social Security. There's a lot more people who are retired. This is great news that we're living a long time for everyone except the Treasury Secretary. I mean, I always figured the day they got a cure for cancer, the Treasury Secretary killed himself. And we're also having fewer babies. For a lot of good reasons, we're not having as many children. That means there are fewer and fewer workers who are supporting each retiree. In 1950, there were 16 people who were working and paying taxes for every person who was retired. Today, there's 3. And by the time you guys retire, there's going to be less than 2 who have to pay the taxes to support you in retirement. You can see that that burden on each generation is higher and higher. As a result, the return you get on your money gets to be less and less. Just like on the pyramid scheme, the people at the top of the pyramid make out, and when it falls apart down the bottom, people are screwed. So, the very first Social Security recipient was a woman named Ida Mae Fuller from Ludlow, Vermont. And Ida Mae paid $18 in Social Security taxes in her life, and then went on to live to be over 100. She collected $26,000 in Social Security benefits on that $18 payment. Made out all right. And in fact, anybody who retired, well, let's say even 10 years ago, is getting back everything they paid in Social Security taxes with interest and a heck of a lot more besides. But if you retire this morning, you get about a 2.2% rate of return on your money. Now, look, that's positive. You're getting back more than you paid in, but you know, how many of you would really invest in something that earned you just 2%? And for this years. The fact is, most of you will get a negative return. That is, you will die before you collect back what you paid into the system, let alone get any return on any at all, any interest payments at all. So even if we pay you everything we promised you, you're still screwed. And if we cut benefits, it's going to be even worse in terms of what's coming. So basically, all that burden is falling on you. That's still the good news. Because Medicare is in much worse shape than Social Security. Social Security is only $32 trillion in the red. Medicare is at least $55 trillion in the red. I say at least because it all depends on what future health care costs are. See, Social Security is simply demographic. It's simply the fact that we're living longer and having fewer babies, you know, the numbers I just gave you. Medicare has exactly that same problem, plus rising health care costs on top of that. You want to see why Medicare is $55 trillion in the red? Very simple to figure out. There you go. You take it, an average couple, husband and wife, they both earn the median wage in America, which is $55,000 a year. And they average that over the course of their lifetime. They will, in their life, pay $140,000 in Medicare payroll taxes and Medicare premiums after they're retired. $140,000, that's a lot of money. No doubt they paid a bunch into the system. That same couple, on average, will take $422,000 in Medicare benefits out of the system. If everybody in the system is losing the system $300,000 or so, you got a problem. Especially if you're putting more and more people into the system. Another way to look at this. Back in 1975, there were 25 million people on Medicare. And it cost just under $2,000 per year to take care of that person on Medicare. Today, there's about 56 million people on Medicare. We're aging. Because healthcare costs are going up, it now costs over $12,000 per year to take care of every one of those people. More people at a higher cost each. By 2025, there's going to be 73 million people on Medicare. And it's going to cost not nearly $20,000 per year to take care of every one of those people. I mean, you're losing money on every transaction and making it up in volume. It doesn't work. As long as this is the case, we're $55 trillion red in Medicare. So once again, let me tell you students, you aren't getting the Medicare we promised you. We lied to you. Again. One last one, let's look at Medicaid. Last of the three big entitlement programs that's out there. Medicaid, I throw this slide in for one particular reason. Medicaid's in the same boat. We're aging as a society. We've expanded Medicaid under Obamacare. We have a lot of rising poverty, more people on Medicaid for all those reasons, so the number of people are going up. Healthcare costs are rising. That means it's costing more to treat each one of them. The whole program is becoming more and more insolvent. But I use this slide for a particular reason, because I think a lot of people misunderstand what Medicaid is, who's on Medicaid. I mean, think about Medicaid. I throw that out and I say, who gets Medicaid? And people say, well, it's welfare. So, you know, the typical welfare recipient, the stereotype, we have a mother and a couple of kids somewhere in the inner city, they're poor, they're collecting Medicaid. You know what? That's sort of true. If you actually look at who's on Medicaid, it really is the case. 44% of people on Medicaid are kids. And about 31% are adults, basically the mothers of those kids. Sometimes it's intact families, but usually the mother with a couple of kids. So that's what's really it, Medicaid. But that's not where the money's going. Where are we spending the money? 18% of the money spent on Medicaid goes to the elderly. 42% goes to the disabled. That's almost all disabled elderly. So roughly 60% of Medicaid spending is actually not on parents with young kids, but on the elderly. It is largely senior citizens living in nursing homes. That's where that Medicaid money is spent. Medicaid is largely a nursing home program. So just like Social Security and Medicare are basically programs that treat older people at the expense of younger people, so is Medicaid. In fact, there are entire industries that exist that do nothing but teach middle-class people how to shelter their assets so that Medicaid will pick up their nursing home costs. You know, there was an elder law firm where I live in Washington, D.C. We have a radio station, WMAL. Every morning when I'm driving into work, one of the sponsors of the talk news format there is a elder law firm that advertises, don't be a burden to your children. Come in and see us, and we'll teach you how to put your assets in a place where the government can't get them, and you'll qualify for Medicaid for your nursing home expenses. And then unsaid is, and then you can be a burden to my kids. But that's where the money is largely going. These three programs largely redistribute money from young people to older people. That's essentially the purpose of these programs. So what can we do? Well, I'm not going to stand up here and pretend there's an easy answer. There isn't. You can't raise taxes by a little bit on the rich or on Warren Buffett or whatever and solve the problem. You can't cut a handful of unpopular programs. And any solution that addresses the big three entitlement programs means first off facing up young people are telling them to lie, and probably taking on the most powerful lobbying group in Washington, AARP, which exists almost exclusively. Well, AARP is 30 million Americans united by a common love of hotel discounts, but it exists exclusively for the purpose of taking money from young people and giving it to old people. Because basically, we're talking about benefits that the older people depend on. You know, the poorest 20% of American retirees get 80% of their retirement income from Social Security. We're talking about programs people depend on. And yet, if we keep paying them, we're talking about sticking it to young people who can barely afford it themselves. It's a real problem. There's no painless solution. But doing nothing is not an option. I believe it was Ben Stein who used to say, that which cannot go on forever eventually stops. Or one of my favorite quotes from Maggie Thatcher is, the problem with the modern welfare state is eventually you run out of other people's money. We've run out of money. You know, every year that we wait, the problem gets worse. Hundreds of billions of dollars worse every year. You know, and there's two really big problems with this. One is it's terribly unfair to young people. You know, it's a little bit like we're having a party and then say, send the bill to my kids. They don't even get to take advantage of these programs and we're expecting them to pay for it. And we're not just talking about people who are here now who can vote, we're talking about generations that aren't even born yet. Get absolutely no say in this, and yet we're expecting to pass the bill on to them. How immoral is that? And at the same time, the debt overhang is already slowing economic growth, costing us jobs, and lowering wages. The Congressional Budget Office says that we earn $3,000 to $5,000 less each year than we would in the absence of this debt. Because look, businesses look out there, they see this debt, and they know that means future taxes, and that means they're less willing to invest and pay people and all the rest that goes with that. We are sticking it to ourselves now, and we're sticking it to ourselves in the future. And we sort of know where this leads. Now, I show this slide in a lot of places and people object to it. They say, oh, the United States is nothing like Greece. Well, you know, they're right in some ways. We're a much bigger economy. You know, that means we can absorb a lot more problems, a lot more debt. You know, we control our own currency. We own our own debt. We're not in hock to the European Central Bank. But you know something? Let me leave you with this slide. This bottom line is the last 25 years of Greek debt as a percentage of GDP. You just start here, just trace it back 25 years ago. This line is the Congressional Budget Office projections of our debt over the next 25 years as a percent of GDP. Thanksgiving. Notice any similarities. So maybe we're not going to quite end up like Greece, but we're coming in for a landing. And we have a choice. If we start making changes now, we could develop a glide path that's going to come in for a nice, slow landing. If we wait, our landing path might be slightly more vertical. But one way or another, we're coming in for a landing. So I've been pretty depressing tonight. Didn't get through that upbeat, glass half full type of stuff. And I don't want to be depressing, but I want to impress on you the fact that the change has to come. And it will only come if the people in Washington hear from you. Because frankly, they hear from the special interests. They hear from the lobbies that are out there. And particularly, I want to address you young folks. The likelihood of someone's voting is roughly the equivalent of their age. 70% of 70-year-olds voted, 30% of 30-year-olds voted. And you could almost draw a line in between and then it continues on down. As long as that's the case, the people in Washington don't care about